All right, these notes are going to give you some more information regarding square roots and evaluating them this time instead of simplifying them, and then solving some quadratic equations. So I'm going to go back and recap some of the symbols we've been talking about since the new unit began, just to make sure that you're on the same page with me. The symbols that we are going to be using are your square root symbols, but remember they have new names now. So the square root symbol is officially known as the radical sign. Right? And the number underneath, or variable underneath, depending on what's underneath there, right, is known as the radicand. And then there's something about the answers that comes out differently each time it's written. If you have just the radical of a number, then your answer is determined to be positive. So that's a positive answer. Okay. If you have a negative sign on the outside of the radical, then that is determined to be a negative answer. If you have a positive and a negative sign, it's known as the plus minus sign, and there is no button for this on your calculator, so you have to make sure you write it every time you want it. If that appears outside of the radical sign, then that means that you have both positive and negative answers. You have one of each. Okay, so instead of writing two separate numbers, we write the plus minus sign, and that satisfies both the positive and the negative ones. And then if you have the radical sign with a negative number underneath it, or something negative underneath it, you can never take the square root of a negative value, right? Because there's just no such thing, right? So when this happens, we say that there's no real solution. There is a solution, it's just not part of the real number system, right? And you will learn more about that when you get to Algebra 2. But for right now, understand that if you try to type in the square root of -4, it will not tell you -2, right? It will tell you that there is an error because you cannot do it, and it will say non-real, right? Which is your clue to say no real solution. Right. The next thing that we're going to make sure we remember is that list of perfect squares that you should have memorized right now, right? Because of as much as we've been dealing with it in class in terms of simplifying, this should be automatic for you, right? And those perfect squares, okay, are once again 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 169, 196, and 225. And then you can keep going more if you need to, right? But for the first 15, right, there's where they are. Right. The next thing that we're going to be dealing with are what are known as radical expressions, right? Because it's got the word radical in it, that means it involves the square root sign, and an expression is a math problem with no equal sign, right? So this is where you will have problems that you will have to evaluate, right, based on the fact that they have a radical in them, right? So this is an expression involving a radical sign. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of examples just so you see what I'm talking about. Right, the first one would be if I have radical 5 plus 4. 5 plus 4 is an expression, and it's underneath the radical sign. So we simplify this to make it square root of 9, and then we simplify further. Square root of 9 makes 3. So the final answer to this one would be 3. Okay. Likewise, if I had plus or minus the square root of 45 minus 20. Okay, I still have an expression underneath my radical sign. I also have a plus minus sign outside, which means it stays with my answer. So I have plus minus square root, and then 45 minus 20 is 25, right? And we know that the square root of 25 is 5, so your final answer is plus minus 5, which means that it's positive 5 and negative 5. So it's two answers, but it's written with one symbol. Okay. All right, then the next thing that we're going to practice with after all this is how to solve quadratic equations, right? And this is different than factoring. You can solve quadratic equations by factoring, but many of these that I'm getting ready to show you are not by factoring because factoring won't work, right? So there is a different set of steps to follow, right? So to solve quadratic equations, and remember, they must have a high power of 2 to be considered quadratic, and they must have an equal sign to be an equation. You are going to isolate, which means get it by itself, the x squared, then take the square root of both sides to get x, because the opposite of squaring a number is square rooting it, right? So that's what we'll take a look at, right? And then there will be 3 possible outcomes, and this is where you've got to make sure you ask yourself, which one am I dealing with, right? And I'll try to help you out as much as possible in terms of ways to remember this, but there are 3 possible outcomes. The first one, if x squared equals a positive number, right, then you get 2 answers. And when you have 2 answers, right, you must use the plus minus sign. Okay, so this is where you'll have plus or minus something. Okay. The second possible outcome, if x squared equals 0, then x equals 0, right? Because if you square root both sides, the square root of 0 is still 0. And the third possible outcome, if x squared equals a negative number, right, then there is no real solution. Because remember, you cannot square root a negative number. Okay, so I will keep asking yourself over and over again as we get to this point, when you go to do your very last step, which one of these 3 cases it might be. And then that's how you're going to determine your answer. All right, so let's take a look at some of these examples. And we will practice more of these in the sheet that you've also got accompanying this set of notes. All right, so if you have 4x squared minus 100 equals 0, right, you still have to get x squared by itself, so you still have to think about your normal equation solving steps. I will need to add 100 over. So now I have 4x squared equals 100. Then I will need to get rid of the 4 by dividing by 4. And now I have x squared equals 25. Well, I know in order to get rid of this squared, I have to do the square root so that it cancels off. Well, my 25 on the other side is a positive number. So when I go to square root the 25, yes, I get a 5, but because that 25 was positive, I also need the plus minus sign in my final answer. So this one has 2 answers, the positive 5 and the negative 5. And if you plugged either one of those back into the original equation, they both would work, right? So that's why you need both answers, right? So for the second one, if I try to solve 8y squared equals 0, okay, I still have to get rid of the 8, so I'm going to divide by 8 on both sides. That gives me y squared equals 0. You always have to show in your work that you have taken the square root of both sides to cancel off that squared, right? The square root of 0 is just 0. It's not positive, so you don't need 2 answers. Plus, you can only have 1 answer because 0 is neutral, and your answer becomes y equals 0. So that would be the second case, right? The third one we want to take a look at, if we have x squared plus 1.44 equals 0, and yes, you can have decimals stuck in these equations, right? You can also have fractions in there. You deal with them the way you normally would deal with them in any equation that you have, right? So if I want to get x squared by itself, the first thing I have to do is subtract 1.44 from both sides. So now I have x squared equals negative 1.44. I have to square root both sides to make that squared go away. But you notice I just tried to take the square root of a negative number, and I can't do that. So in this case, there is no real solutions. Okay, and no, you cannot write NRS. That is not an abbreviation that is acceptable. You must write no real solutions. And this is as short as it can get. Okay, so then there are other radical things we have to be able to do with square roots, and this is where your calculator comes in super handy, right? So I'm calling these the other radical examples, right? Because they deal with some of what we just did, but sometimes some newer stuff, right? So for example, that's all these are, is different examples. If I have the square root of negative 36, you should now be able to tell me that there are no real solutions to this, because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. If I give you something like negative square root of 0.04, yes, there's a decimal under there, but you still need to type that in the calculator, because it does come out to be 0.2, and because the negative's on the outside, that means your answer is negative 0.2. Okay. For the next one, if I give you plus or minus square root of 0.81, plug in the square root of 0.81 in the calculator first, and you'll get 0.9. Okay, but because there's a plus or minus sign on the outside, you must have the plus or minus sign in your answer. Okay, if it's already given to you there and it says to evaluate or simplify with it, you have to put it there. Right, but if it's part of an equation and you have to determine when to use it, that's something you'll have to know differently. All right, for the next one, this one looks a little different, but it's still using a radical expression. Right, it's going to tell you to do this, and you're going to find this piece of a formula later on in this chapter, right, once we start getting towards the end. But for right now, you just have to know how to evaluate with it. All right, so you want to evaluate b squared minus 4 times a times c, all under the radical, if a equals 3, b equals -7, and c equals 6. Remember, this is where you take the letters out, put the numbers in. Right? If you're going to use your calculator to help you out with this, please use parentheses around all values when you type it in. Right? Otherwise, the calculator will misinterpret what you're trying to say, and it will come out with the wrong answer. Or you can play it safe and use the calculator very minimally. Right? So for b squared, because b is a negative number, I have to put -7 in parentheses and then the squared. If you do not do that, you've already messed up your problem. All negative b values must remain in parentheses. Right, then do -4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is 6. And all of that's under the radical sign. Right, if you go through PEMDAS, you've got to do all of that under the radical sign first before you can take the square root last. Right, so if I get down to all of this, my square has to be done first. Right, so if I'm trying not to use the calculator the whole time, -7 squared is +49. Minus, and then you can do all three of these together. 4 times 3 is 12, 12 times 6 is 72. So now I'm down to this expression. Well, then I can do 49 minus 72, which is going to give me -23, but that's still under the radical. And now when I get down to this point, my calculator is going to tell me I can't do this because there is no real solution. Okay, if you type it into the calculator from the beginning, right, without doing any of the little steps along the way, as long as you use parentheses and everything looks the way it's supposed to be and everything is under the radical sign, then it will also tell you no real solutions. Right, but if you're not getting that same answer, then you need to either learn how to type it in better or you need to resort back to using order of operations. Right, for this next one though, it has to be strictly calculator based because the answers do come out to be pretty weird decimals, and the only way you're going to get them to come out the way you want them to is to use the calculator correctly. All right, so it is going to say evaluate, and then it's going to say round to the hundredths place. That is standard rounding place. You will never see this same question asking you to round to anywhere but the hundredths place. Right, so here's what the problem looks like. It's going to say 7 plus or minus 3 radical 2 all divided by -1. Right, and when you see this type of problem, there are two answers to this problem. And the reason I know there's two answers is because of the symbol sitting right in the middle. Okay, this plus or minus sign right here makes those two answers happen. So you've essentially got two separate problems you're going to have to use the calculator for to help you out. Right? The first problem is just going to be 7 plus 3 radical 2 divide by -1. That will get you one of your answers. The other one is going to come from 7 minus 3 radical 2 divide by -1. You have to type in two separate problems to get two separate answers, right? And it is very picky on how it wants it to be in the calculator, right? So here's my best attempt to give you the advice of how to type it in the calculator. We can focus more of it in class if you're still not getting it the way it needs to be, right? So here are directions to type in the calculator. Okay? And again, you drop one parentheses and your calculator will not like you. It is very picky. Right, so here's how you would enter these. You have to think about the numerator and the denominator as a fraction, and in fractions we enter it as parentheses. So you're going to open up your parentheses and you're going to tell the calculator put all this stuff in together. So here's where you're going to do 7 plus 3 radical 2. Now some of you, when your calculator, when you open up the radical sign, it'll open up parentheses. If that's yours, you put 2, you close the parentheses, and then you close the outside parentheses. If your calculator does not do that, you only need the one set. All right, so make sure you understand how your individual calculator is operating. And then you want to say divide by -1 and hit enter. Okay, when you do this, you will get the answer of -11 11.24, rounded to the hundredths place. So that's one of those answers. That's the answer for the first one, right? Then when we go and do the second one, we're going to type it in exactly the same, except instead of a plus sign at the beginning, you're going to put a minus sign. So it's parentheses 7 minus 3 radical 2. And again, if you need parentheses for your 2, please do so, and then close your outside parentheses. Divide by -1. Everything is exactly the same except for that minus sign. Hit enter once again, and it will give you a new number, and that new number needs to be rounded to the hundredths place, and in this case it would be -2.76, right? So the two answers for this problem do get written as braces, right, because they are answers, they are solutions to this once we evaluate it, and that is going to be -11.24 and -2.76. Right, so we're going to practice with using these buttons in a class and making sure that everybody can get the same answers by typing in the same stuff. Right, but do practice around, change some numbers up, and make up your own problems and see if you can come out with using the calculator the way you need to.